Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. Today, we're going to look at an introduction to Greek tragedy. I hope you find this lecture useful as you look at some of the Greek tragedies we may be studying in the course, such as those by Sophocles or Aeschylus or Euripides. Without further ado, I'm going to call up the presentation that we'll use to guide the discussion. And you can see that we'll talk about today what is tragedy. We'll start with a definition of tragedy in the Greek tragic sense of the word. We'll talk about the political and cultural context of 6th and 5th century Athens, which is important for understanding what's going on with tragedy. We'll talk a bit about the origins of tragedy, the ritual. Cambridge Ritualists, for example, have a certain theory about how tragedy came about. We'll talk about some of the physical attributes of ancient Greek staging, and we'll leave off with the first, let's say, thorough articulation of what's going on in Greek tragedy in Aristotle's Poetics. So let's start with the definition. What is tragedy? So our general sense is of tragedy being an unfortunate event or a type of drama. Okay, so the Oxford English Dictionary gives these two definitions: an event causing great suffering, destruction, and distress, such as serious accident, crime, or natural catastrophe. For instance, a tragedy that killed 95 people. Or we might think of it as a play dealing with tragic events and a play dealing with destruction, distress, suffering, and having an unhappy ending, especially one concerning the downfall of the main character, for instance, Shakespeare's tragedies. So that's our modern sense. The original Greek sense of the term referred to a specific dramatic performance, and it was more about the form and the time and place and less about the content. It was less about the play being about sad matter or something like that. It was about the time and place and the form of presentation in this as part of these rituals in honor of the Greek god Dionysus. So the plays were performed at these annual festivals in honor of the Greek god Dionysus. The most important of these festivals was the city Dionysia, a festival held in late March. And as part of these festivities, they would have theatrical competitions. So it's an important point a lot of people don't know, is that it wasn't just, let's go to watch these plays, it's kind of fun. It's a competition. Greeks had competition for everything, and actually Nietzsche has a great essay called Homer on Competition, or Homer's Contest. And it's not just about Homer, but it's about the whole agonistic, so contest-based culture of the Greeks. So tragedians who wished to compete submitted a request to the Archon and the principal civil magistrate in Athens there. And he chose 3 tragedians who competed against one another for first, second, third prize, right? And so each tragedian would enter 3 tragedies, a trilogy, plus a 4th short satyr play, it's called. So the 4 plays together would be called a tetralogy. The satyr play seems to have been a burlesque, often connected thematically to the tragedies that preceded it, but we know very little about these plays. We have only one complete copy surviving, and that's Euripides' Cyclops. So the Greek word where we get tragedy from is tragoidia, so meaning tragos, goat, and oidia, song. And so it seems to have meant literally goat song. And scholars used to think that this referred to the fact that there would be these satyrs in the chorus. So however, Athenian art shows satyrs as with horse's tail and not necessarily as goat-like. So the most commonly accepted etymology now is the word meant, let's say, something like song for a goat. They're competing for the goat as a prize. Another theory is that the chorus was made of adolescents, so the goat song is the kind of cracky voice of adolescent voice singing that song. So to reiterate, the subject matter didn't have to be tragic in the modern sense. So Aristotle, who's writing in the 330s of BCE, said that the plot of the tragedy had to be serious. So serious doesn't necessarily mean sad. Many of them do feature sad or disastrous events. So I think from that, our modern usage focuses on this aspect of it, and that has survived as kind of the defining feature of what it is to be tragic. So let's turn to the political and cultural context. So the 6th and 5th centuries BCE in Greece were really the defining classical era that people turn to when they're studying the Greeks most often. And tragedy developed in this period, in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, most likely out of choral performances of poetry that were widespread in archaic Greece. And according to tradition, Thespis added an actor to the chorus. So there'd be a chorus of multiple individuals singing this song or this poetic verse, and Thespis pulls one of the members out to act as a single speaker in relation to this communal chorus. And by the end of the 6th century, tragedies of this format were being regularly performed at the city Dionysia. So in the 5th century BCE, so this is really the peak of Greek cultural achievement. We have in politics, we have democracy developing, most notably in Athens. In literature, we saw the creation of the genres of tragedy and comedy and the genre of history in figures such as Herodotus and Thucydides. We see the birth and flourishing of scientific and philosophic thinking. So Socrates, of course, Plato, and later on in that century. We have architecture under the leader Pericles. Many of the most famous buildings in ancient Athens, including the Parthenon, were constructed in this period. What marks the century also are a couple of wars, key sets of wars. One that kind of began the century, which Athens was instrumental in helping the Greeks win against the Persians. And then one at the end of that century, the Peloponnesian War, where Athens lost. So here's a map of Greece and Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, right? And we see here at a very high level the two Persian wars fought 10 years apart. And the first major campaign led to the Battle of Marathon, and the Persians, you see in that green line, their campaign was bringing troops over by fleet, landing on the territory of Attica there. Athens sent out an army and defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. A much more, and also in a much more trying, let's say the second bout of the Persian Wars was, and we see the two red lines there, a large fleet as well as a large land army marching across the Hellespont, leading to the Battle of Thermopylae. And maybe people have seen that old movie 300. This is Sparta, where the Spartan troops held the pass at Thermopylae. Kind of a Pyrrhic victory. They ended up losing, but they held them off for a bit. the Persians then went and sacked and burned, flattened Athens to the grounds. The Athenians are out on their ships. They've no home, and they battle the Persians and the Battle of Salamis, in the straits between the island of Salamis and Athens, and maybe the greatest naval victory ever. Defeated this navy that was had overpowered it to a great extent, and effectively ended that Persian invasion. So, as I said, the Athenians very say decisively contributing to the Greek victory over the Persians in these two wars, and managed to maintain themselves as distinct city-states and cultures, and in this period because of their victory there. Athens then developed this huge naval power in a league of allied city-states after the Persian Wars, and became effectively a large empire. And resentment over Athens' growing power was instrumental in causing the second great war of the 5th century, which is the Peloponnesian War, which is Sparta and her allies versus Athens and her allies. So you can see in blue and in burgundy the two, let's say, sets of allies. So Athens and her allies in blue, and then in burgundy, Sparta and her allies, effectively fighting for nearly 30 years on and off. And Athens, we see Sicily inset there on the map. It's probably hubris, the fact that they felt that they could pull off such a daring expedition. Famously sent a large expedition to try to take over Sicily, which was ended up losing hundreds of ships, thousands of men, resources, and leading to the downfall of Athens and her empire towards the end of the Peloponnesian War. So tragedy reached its zenith probably between these two wars, although there's still some tragedies occurring during the Peloponnesian War. And there are three great tragedians in this period. Aeschylus, who lived from 525 to 456 BCE. And we know the title of 82 of his plays. He may have written around 90, but we have only 7. So I want you to think about that. If we had only or less than 10% of the plays of Shakespeare, so Shakespeare wrote probably 38 plays. We have them all. You know, the state of their textual integrity is pretty good. You know, we have them complete. There's question marks around individual lines here and there, and but we have 38 plays complete. What if we had less than 10% of his output? What if we had 3 of his plays? What would we know about Shakespeare? What would be the cultural loss? And this is what I'm going to reiterate here when it comes to the ancient Greeks. What is the cultural loss, and how much do we not know about the Greeks because of what we don't have extant? Sophocles, even more striking. He lived between 496 and 406. So our sources say he wrote probably 123 plays. Again, only 7 survive. So an even lower proportion of the total output survives for us to be able to try to get a sense of Sophocles' insight into the human condition. Euripides, we have a bit more, but still not as much as we would like, right? So Euripides, the younger of the 3, he lived between 480 and 406 BCE, probably wrote around 92 plays, and we have 17 or 18. So one of the tragedies, Rhesus, is almost definitely not by Euripides. And one of the plays, as I mentioned, Cyclops, is our only surviving satyr play. So we know the names of several other tragedians from the late 6th and 5th centuries, but only fragments of their works have survived. And overall, probably about 1,000 tragedies were written in the 5th century BCE, and we have 32. So about 3% of the output. So again, think of what are the gaps in not only our knowledge of the Greeks, but let's say different insights we could have into the human condition. The subject matter of tragedy was drawn almost exclusively from traditional myth. Occasionally, they drew on recent history. So the oldest extant tragedy that we have, Aeschylus' Persians, deals with the Athenian victory at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. And this type of subject matter apparently didn't work and wasn't the norm. So it's the only one that we know of that or that we have surviving that dealt with kind of recent events, so to speak. And perhaps it's because the social critique that the tragedy is doing of the time is too close. So if the tragedies in a way want the thoughtful audience member or reader or listener to think critically about their own world, their own society, and if they're dealing with recent events that can be a little bit too close to home, and people see the critique in effect. I'll note here, as you see in the bottom bullet, that Shakespeare too turned from, in his early to late 1590s when he was writing, he took on as a subject matter the English history, so dealing with relatively recent English history, such as the War of the Roses that had happened maybe a century before his time, century and a half before his time, and led to the installation of the dynasty, the Tudor dynasty that he was writing under in the form of Elizabeth I. So is that, let's say, too close to home? And did he realize that he had to turn from that to maybe something a bit more distant past, which he does when he goes from English history to what we could call his Roman historical period, where he writes about Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. So because they take the plots of tragedy from myth, it meant that the broad outlines of the story would have been known to most of the audience. So the tragedian's skill and creativity was not in inventing the plot or the story, but in how you made use of the material to pull out certain thematics. So rather than just the plot, what's important, well, plot's crucially important because the plot is how they, let's say, the plot is how they structure the story. So that's a creative input of the tragedians. But what's also important is how they pull out, let's say, family conflicts or themes of justice, the tension between public and private, duty, dangers of political power, relationships between the sections, as a way to comment on social themes and their own society. And the other thing I'll point out is that the use of myth meant that the tragedies have in effect a double time frame. So the plots are set in a heroic age of a fairly distant past. So they're looking at an age that ended with the Trojan War, which for their understanding and for ours happened around 1184 BCE. So that's the time frame that the tragedies are mostly set. But they're also referring to events in their own day, 700 years later in 5th century Athens. So I want to refer to Athenian democracy as part of this context that's helpful for understanding tragedy as a form, okay? So Cleisthenes reforms at the end of the 6th century, opened the way for a new form of government ruled by the people, the demos. And Athenian democracy was direct, not representative. So that means that all male citizens are there in the assembly. Well, not all of them at any given time, but all of them could be there at any given time to vote on matters. And we're talking about free male citizens over the age of 20 had access to the General Assembly. So to give a sense of scale, the total population of Attica in the mid-5th century, including slaves and foreigners, may have been around 315,000. And of those, 43,000 would have been, approximately 43,000 would have been male citizens. And all of them are eligible to vote in the assembly, and a quorum of 6,000 was required for some categories of decisions. Now, not everybody's in the assembly all the time. Maybe they got a job, right? Maybe they have to work and stuff like that. But you are probably talking about thousands of people in this assembly. And it's difficult for us to imagine, right? It's chaotic enough in the Canadian House of Parliament with 338, is it now, members? So the public assemblies for discussing issues of importance gained a significance they never had before, okay, in Athens at this time because of this democratic form of government. So theatrical performance shares some important characteristics with assemblies featuring public oratory. So the audience is accustomed in both formats, in both the theater and in the assembly, to meeting with other people for long periods, to listening attentively to the points of view put forward by different speakers, trying to judge which speaker was the most truthful. And so both of these forms, the theater and the assembly, drew on and influenced, or let's say contributed to the importance of the rise of this relatively new discipline called rhetoric or sophistry in the 5th century. So these are people teaching, sophists, or people teaching rhetoric, among other things, as a means to educate young men to be successful in political life. How can you effectively make the case? Now, of course, Plato was to criticize the sophists because for Plato, the sophists didn't care about truth. They just care about the rhetorical persuasion, and famously, he felt that they could make the weaker argument defeat the stronger argument. Okay, it's taking that from Aristophanes' Clouds. I highly recommend that work as well. Let's talk about the origins of tragedy. So Dionysus, the Greek tragedy is closely connected with him, one of many Greek gods. And Dionysus is associated with theater, but also frenzy, irrationality, nature and vegetation, wine and drunkenness. So in myth, Dionysus's male followers are called satyrs, and they're creatures who blend human and animal characteristics. And his mythic female followers are maenads, women who constantly, under the influence and gifted with exceptional abilities, and they're able to rip apart animals and eat their flesh raw, etc. This kind of thematic of the maenads was played upon in a recent series of, I think might have been on Crave or whatever, or Prime or Video, called Yellow Jackets. So it has these stranded teenage girls who end up becoming inspired by some sort of force and behave in certain episodes like these maenads from Greek myth. So Dionysus what's the story with Dionysus? Well, his mother was Semele, a princess of Thebes, who had an affair with Zeus, the king of the gods. And she was incinerated when she saw Zeus in his full glory, but Zeus snatched the embryonic Dionysus from her womb and planted him in his thigh, and Dionysus was born later from the thigh of Zeus. And this is likely where Dionysus gets the epithet twice born. And Dionysus is often contrasted with his brother Apollo, who's, among other things, the god of reason and moderation. And this opposition of the Apollonian and the Dionysian was first fully articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche in his seminal work, The Birth of Tragedy. So Nietzsche identified the Apollonian as the spirit of measure, moderation, reason, and he saw the Dionysian as the spirit of intoxication, the loss of self, excess, and a union with the one. And Apollo underlay the plastic arts, so sculpture, those types of things, and Dionysus underlay music. So music, it doesn't have a form, it doesn't have a fixed outline, and it's temporal, not static. So Nietzsche makes much of that distinction, and he saw tragedy as this conflict between the Dionysian chorus and the Apollonian characters. So characters are individuated; they have an individual, discrete identity, and if you're absorbed in the chorus, you're absorbed in the kind of the oneness of things and into the song of the chorus, music, those types of things. So modern scholars have tried to discover the exact nature of and reason for tragedy's association with Dionysus by examining tragedy's origins. And the theories of the origins of tragedy fall into two main groups. There's one group looks for the origins in religious ritual, and a second group sees the origins in a fusion of the epic recitation and choral song that had no direct connection to ritual. Okay, so the ritual theory has been enormously influential, and it can be traced back to Aristotle's statement that tragedy developed out of dithyram, a choral song in honor of Dionysus. So according to the ritual theory, tragedy and comedy and dithyram all developed out of earlier rituals in honor of Dionysus. And of course, this again grew out of Nietzsche, but for Nietzsche, he was not primarily interested in the origins of tragedy, but in this ongoing interplay of Apollo and Dionysus. And Nietzsche stated that until Euripides, before Euripides, Dionysus was always the sole protagonist of Greek tragedy. So other characters, so Oedipus, Prometheus, and so on, they're masks of Dionysus, according to Nietzsche. So these were really picked up, these Nietzschean themes were picked up by the Cambridge Ritualists, who were working in the first half of the 20th century, and still heavily influential in scholarly endeavors into Greek tragedy. And they took as axiomatic the idea that tragedy originated in Dionysian rituals, and that the original ritual pattern could be discovered behind extant tragedies. And the pattern had to do with the death and rebirth of Dionysus. So the Cambridge ritualists thought that the proto-tragedy must have been a ritual drama or passion play about Dionysus. So the leader of these Cambridge ritualists, Gilbert Murray, reconstructed this assumed pattern as he perceived it in the surviving tragedies. So it begins with an agon or contest of the god Dionysus with his enemy, and it's followed by the suffering in which the god is killed, and this is reported by a messenger speech. This leads to a lament for the old god, and then the drama finally, there's a recognition of the dead god's body, followed by a resurrection and epiphany, which he called a theophany. So for him, all the extant tragedies have some sort of veiled a veiled reference to this pattern. So they're just kind of overlays on this pattern. Modern scholars accept that tragedy's origins were in Dionysian ritual, but they differ from Murray in that they don't feel that the original pattern has to determine the form of later tragedies. So they don't see every tragedy as following that pattern. They tend to see the defining moment in the creation of drama as the moment when tragedy shed its ritual origins. They still believe, though, they reject Murray's notion of a pattern drama, but they still feel that the tragedies reflect in different ways the Dionysian origins. So let's turn now to the theatrical staging. So the staging was quite different than when you think of a play, when we moderns think of a play, we probably think of, whether it's, something at the National Arts Center, somebody in a stage, it's dark, it's inside, there's artificial lighting, that type of thing. So we have to get our minds around what happens in ancient Greek staging in ancient Greek theater. So our word for theater comes from theatron, and which is this fan-shaped auditorium built into a natural hillside. And the auditorium looks down into an orchestra, which means dancing place. Okay. And there's a skene building. So we can see here the skene building that stood at the back of the orchestra. The skene building originally was probably just a tent. It's an area some sort of covered structure so that the actors can change masks or whatever they need to do and enter. And then later probably took on a more permanent structure. The cast of a Greek tragedy consisted of actors and a chorus. The Greek word for actor, hypokrites, probably means interpreter or answerer. The actor stood apart from the chorus and interpreted or answered the chorus's lyrics. At first, drama probably only had one actor. As I mentioned, Thespis is credited with adding this first actor, and Aeschylus is credited with adding the second actor. And Sophocles may have added the third actor. The actors were all male, and 3 of them played all the individual roles in any given tragedy. The actor would perform 2 or 3 roles in each play. The great female characters, Clytemnestra, Medea, they're all played by males. So think also of the practice in Renaissance England of the plays there where boys played women's parts. So similar convention there, again, foreign to modern or our sense of what you would want or need to have in a naturalistic performance. Both of these aspects, so the fact that women were played by males and one person's playing several parts, both of these are facilitated by the use of masks. Along with the 3 actors, the tragedy uses a chorus, and they wore masks as well. And they were not professional actors, unlike the main characters. They were ordinary citizens, and there was probably 12 to 15. The chorus often represents a marginal group, old men, women, slaves, and it doesn't take part in the action, but comments on the action. Chorus comes from a Greek word meaning dance. So choreography is kind of the writing of the dance, right? Chorus members sang their lines, but danced simultaneously. That's a big part of the ancient Greek theater that we don't know about or we've lost, is the musical aspect of it. So they're singing a song, they're dancing. They were accompanied by an aulos, a double reeded wind instrument. And we have some base paintings that show, such as the one on the right here, that show chorus is in motion, but they're difficult to interpret what's going on. So we don't have a good sense of how their dance worked, that type of thing. So the structure of the tragedies are fairly consistent. They begin with a prologue. It's a relatively short introductory speech or exchange of speeches before the entrance of the chorus. Now the chorus, so the prologue sets the scene. It tells the audience where the play's action's taking place, the time and the overall myth. And sometimes the play may start directly with the chorus's entrance, which is called the parodos, but generally they have this prologue. And the entrance of this chorus is called parodos, which just literally means entrance. And they're singing a song as they enter, and establishes the chorus's identity as, for example, old men or female slaves, and provides some background. After the parodos, the play's action develops in several episodes. There are interactions between the actors or between the actor and the chorus, and the episodes are divided by choral songs. The choral songs are called stasima, plural, and a singular stasimon. And each stasima, each choral song that divides the episodes, are divided into pairs of verses called strophes strophes and antistrophes. And each pair, the antistrophe, is the exactly metrical equivalent of the preceding strophe. So the choral dance may have followed a symmetrical pattern of the song's meter. Like, for instance, during the strophe, maybe they danced a certain dance to the right. And then during the antistrophe, maybe they danced in a kind of mirror pattern to the left. The final section of the tragedy is an exodus. The chorus leaves the orchestra, and the final choral song is usually very short. Now, the staging, the audience might have consisted between 12, 17,000 people acting. The conditions of outdoor Greek theater preclude necessarily any naturalistic acting. They don't have film techniques of the close facial close-up where we can see minor accentuations of the face to see that maybe there's a tinge of sadness in that person's eyes or something like that. No, they had to be exaggerated. They had to be over the top and stylized in their reactions, right? And also that's precluded by their masks, right? The facial expressions are not there. They have to do probably big exaggerated hand motions to convey what they're doing. A few unique devices to highlight here. The echoclema, so this kind of wheeled device here, is used for displaying scenes that were conceived of as happening inside the Skene building. So the Skene building here at the back of the stage may represent, let's say, a house. So in Agamemnon, it represents the house of Agamemnon that he returns to. And this echoclema may have been used to wheel out with Clytemnestra on top, wheel out the bodies of Agamemnon and to demonstrate that she had killed them inside the house. We also have this mechane structure, type of crane that could be used to fly actors across or over the Skene building. And from that, we get the term Deus ex machina from Latin. I want to end on discussing Aristotle's Poetics. So the first thorough articulation of what's going on in tragedy, and has really shaped not just our interpretations of tragedy, but literary theory about how we interpret a lot of genres ever since Aristotle's work. Okay, so work, but it's probably consists of course notes, maybe from students. It's fairly rough in places. So they're course notes from the 330s BCE, and the title is Poetics, or the art of whatever the verb poein means, okay? And broadly, poein means to do or make, akin to faire in French or mach in German. Narrowly, it would mean poetry, the art of making or the art of poetry. So it could be translated as the art of poetry. But Aristotle underscores within it how poein is synonymous with the pratine, which is action. So it's also the art of action. In a way, the art of poetry is also about the art of action. So too, we have to keep in mind Aristotle's political and ethical philosophy. So for Aristotle, actions have ends or purposes, and the end or telos of the soul, for instance, is happiness, which is actualized in virtuous action. The activity itself is not necessarily good. For instance, the virtue of courage may require killing others in war. So the act of killing someone is not what is virtuous. It's only made good as an action seen in the larger context of the whole, its purpose, its end, and we only see that via reflection and imagination, okay? So we can see the actions of Hector and Achilles, for instance, as wholes because of Homer. Because of Homer's work as a poet, he's able to bring that forth. And so we could say that poetry is this imitation of an action such that the whole and the completeness of the action is seen. And the Greek word for imitation is mimesis, and it allows an action to arise as a whole, rather than as a random series of occurrences with no beginning or end. And we see this in imaginative literature, this type of imitation, but also in our own actions, we can see them as emulations of, or imitations of what we think would be an imagined end, okay? So that art of poetry is important both for action and poetry in a narrow sense. Aristotle says that poetry is representation, mimesis, with the types of poetry differentiated by the media they use, so maybe rhythm, song, verse, the objects, whether it's a representation of, like the object of representation is a good character or a bad. How, the manner of representation, are you using narrative or drama? So narrative, I say, so-and-so went down to the store, he bought this, he ran into so-and-so, they had a conflict. So that's a narrator, someone standing outside, telling of the events. In drama, we see a direct representation of that. We wouldn't have a narrator saying he went to the store. In drama, we have a direct mimesis where so-and-so is going down to the store. An actor is showing us going down the store. Another actor comes along and they have a conflict. So poetry is both natural and pleasurable. Humans naturally represent and learn from this. And there's a pleasure and education in seeing the form. So there's thus even a pleasure in seeing something tragic, okay? So there's pleasure and education in seeing the form, seeing the wholeness of the action in relation to a whole. So for Aristotle, the highest manifestation of poetic imitation is tragedy. And he comes to the following, I'd say, to summarize his essential definition of tragedy: a representation of a serious, complete action in itself of a certain magnitude with embellished speech. So it's not prose, it's not, let's say, ordinary run-of-the-day speech, with separate elements, verse and song, dramatic, not narrated. Again, not prose, it's not a novel. Arouses pity and fear to affect the catharsis of those emotions. So we'll talk about that in a second. Tragedy consists of the following elements: plot. For him, that plot's most important, which is the structure action. So a story can be any series of events. But a plot, you may want to start over here, and maybe then you want to go back and fill in the blanks in the past. And then by structuring it in that way, the artist is able to show that wholeness of the action, right? So plot, for that reason, I think is so crucial for Aristotle. Then character, then thought. Let's say the intentions or different motivations of the characters and the author. Diction, the word choice. Song, let's say the poetic elements, and spectacle. Plot should imitate a single action as a whole, so he does not like episodic plots. And it progresses through a tragic error, a hamartia, a reversal, a peripeteia, is a change of action to its opposite. So the messenger speech in Oedipus the King is an example where things are going one way, and then Oedipus discovers that his whole identity is different, and it reverses his fortune from great man to scourge of the city. Recognition, so there's this anagnoresis, a movement from agnoia, not knowing, to gnosis, ignorance to knowledge. And the realization of the hero, that's what this anagnoresis is it's a recognition often of who they really are. The Oedipus the King example is a good one. And for Aristotle, the best ones are where the peripeteia and the anagnoresis occur at the same time. And again, Oedipus the King is his example. So the goal of the tragic representation is arousing pity and fear to the effect that a catharsis of these emotions. So we mentioned that before. So catharsis, there's a lot of critical ink spilled on trying to fully understand what this concept means, but I think we could see it as a way of, well, one way of thinking about it is, we have pity and fear building up, and we need, like, let's say, a release valve, and we're able to arouse pity and fear and have them directed to this action that is presented for us, so that we can have them within a certain measure as we go about our daily lives. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about the catharsis, as a bringing into measure of those emotions through having them directed at this work of art. So there I'll end our discussion of Greek tragedy. I hope you found it useful. Put it in the comments if you have a favorite Greek tragedy. I'll probably do a lecture soon on Oedipus the King. Let me know if there's another one that you'd like to study, and I may put that on a course upcoming, and I'll do a lecture for that as well. Thank you, everyone.